With nothing but a thin plastic sheet to protect themselves from rubber bullets and water cannons, these protesters in Yangon are demonstrating against last week's military coup in Myanmar. They're among tens of thousands of people who say they will take to the streets until their elected representatives are restored.
If the civil disobedience movement accelerates in the country as a whole, the government machinery will stop. I hope all the people will join the movement. We must not lose.
Protests are happening all over the country. We will fight until we win.
The military insists it has acted in the national interest, and it's cracking down on demonstrations. Its response is driving foreign companies to cut ties with the junta, which controls large segments of Myanmar's economy. Japanese beer giant Kirin has ditched a joint venture with a holding company run by Myanmar's military. Suzuki, Toyota, and other Japanese car makers have invested more than $1.7 billion in the country since 2011, but now they're reportedly considering halting operations. And $5.4 billion in trade with neighboring Thailand could be jeopardized if international sanctions are slapped on Myanmar. New Zealand is among some countries already taking measures against the junta. It's suspending aid programs and placing a travel ban on Myanmar's military leaders.
In addition, we've joined with other countries calling for a special session at the United Nations Human Rights Council on Myanmar to raise concerns regarding the military coup and the impact on human rights.
The US and EU are also considering restrictions, but they're concerned sanctions could end up hurting Myanmar's poorest without punishing those who've derailed democracy. 1 in 4 people in the country live below the poverty line.
We should avoid rushing into measures that would adversely affect the most vulnerable part of the population. This often happens when you take restrictive measures. At the end are the poorest among the poorest who pay the consequences. Withdrawing preferences would damage the civilian garment sector while leaving military business unscathed. 500,000 workers would be at risk, mostly women, so we cannot afford taking this kind of measures. We all agree on the need to quick responses to avoid allowing a fait accompli that can last quite a long time. We now need to develop a robust response to this unacceptable seizure of power, which reverses 10 years of democratic transition.
While world leaders debate what action to take, the lives and livelihoods of millions of civilians are hanging in the balance. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Right, for more on this, George McLeod joins me now live from Dakar. He's managing partner at Access Asia. Welcome to the programme. Tell us, George, we're hearing big corporations are scaling back their business in Myanmar, but how much will this actually hurt the military?
Well, I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is that the charge out of Myanmar is being led by Asian companies, and I think that's the first time we've ever seen that. It's usually Western companies that are most reactive to these types of political developments. But as your story notes, Kirin Beer of Japan has pulled out. We've also seen a large conglomerate from Thailand called the Mata Group has pulled out, and surprisingly, even a company from Singapore has pulled out of a joint venture. So these types of things carry a fairly significant economic impact, but also a significant political impact, because it does not fit into the type of anti-Western narrative that the military leaders have previously used.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important point you raised there. But at what stage could this make the military change course?
Well, I mean, on one hand, you know, this is the same group of individuals that was in power under the previous military junta that led from 1962 to 2011 under the SPDC regime. That group of people is very accustomed to the idea of trade sanctions and isolation. So I think that they are quite accustomed to withstanding international pressure. I think the biggest pressure is going to come from Burmese people themselves, Having said that, the EU could play a big role in pressuring the junta by removing Myanmar from its anything but arms trade preferences, which would target the garment sector and jeopardize about 16% of their exports.
And let's talk about the garment sector that employs civilians. We just heard Josep Borrel saying 500,000 workers could be at risk, mainly women. Tell us a bit more from your experience. How could it harm civilians?
Certainly. I mean, the garment sector is a huge employer in Myanmar, and it's the highest growth segment of the Burmese economy last year. So any type of action, particularly by the EU, would place a lot of pressure on the regime in terms of increasing unemployment, but would, as your story suggests, would disproportionately impact female workers. So I think those are things that the international community has to keep in mind when targeting Myanmar through sanctions.
Absolutely. George McLeod, Managing Partner at Access Asia, thank you so much for your time and analysis.